Welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, a joint venture by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. I welcome you to Module 4, Lecture 8, which deals with an important and emerging area of cultural studies. More about this, that is cultural policy, once we do the recap of the last lecture. The last lecture, as you remember, was devoted to cyber culture, and we saw in the beginning that the word cybernetics, the word cyber actually is a prefix. So, we have cyber culture, cyber fiction, cyberpunk, cybernetics, right. So, this word actually was given to us by the famous mathematician Norbert Wiener in his seminal work Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and Machine. The word cyber is derived from the Greek word Kubernetes, meaning steersman or one who is skilled in steering or in governance, and the control here essentially is electronic in nature. So, we also found that cyber culture was referred to as a new era, or what many would call a second media age, in the sense that it had enormous implications for the shift from modernism to postmodern culture, and it was based on new communication systems. Okay, so, we do consider it surely as a continuation, all right, but also as marking a very important shift, if not break, from the older media. So, we also saw that the new cultural formations, okay, that come to us by way of these new communication systems, by way of cyber culture, are the cultural formations that happen on the information superhighway and in virtual reality. So, these are two you could say mega aspects of cyber culture, and our attempt was to look at the cultural formations of identity, subjectivity, of politics and power within information superhighway and virtual reality. Then we also saw through Pramod Nair that cyber culture refers to the electronic environment where various technologies and media forms converge, and among these, as named by Pramod Nair, are the internet, video games, email, online chats, home pages, bioinformatics, among others. Then we also saw, and let me end this recap by referring to some of the key issues, okay, that come up in a cultural studies understanding of cyber culture, and among these some important ones are globalization, techno-capitalism, the issue of corporeality, of the issues of the body, e-governance, identity and subjectivity, of race, class, genders and sexualities, among others, okay, in the information highway and in virtual reality. The others are also very importantly again human rights, then techno addiction, and these new orientations, new movements, cultural and intellectual movements, namely post-industrialism, post-humanism and post-modernism. Fine. So, today the topic of discussion is cultural policy, and with cultural policy we are really nearing the end of these entire series of lectures. We are not going to talk so much about identity and subjectivity, power and representation here so much, as we are going to talk about pragmatic ways of, we've studied cultural studies, right. We've seen what it entails, we've seen its key concepts, its methodologies, its tools, its engagement with various issues, right, like development, various sites like development, even time and space came into our discussion of cultural studies, biology, globalization, consumption, right. So, today we are going to look at something, as I said, which draws us closer to the end of our lectures, and this is on cultural policy and what can we do after having studied, okay, the various aspects of cultural studies. Remember, we said in the early part of the series that cultural studies is not simply something that is academic. Okay, its counterpart is activism, and we do cultural studies not simply to write exams or to write books or to give lectures, but also to make a difference. Okay, we talk about politics, the politics of representation. Why? Not simply to deliberate on them in abstract terms or to draw generalizations, but also to see how may we apply these. So, in today's lecture we are going to see some of the ways in which critics and scholars of cultural studies have dwelt on the issue of cultural policy. So, the key source texts in this lecture from which I shall be gleaning the points and from where I may use quotations from time to time, and in a bid to get to you some important formulations made by critics. So, the key source texts in this lecture are Chris Barker's The Sage Dictionary of Cultural Studies, Chris Barker's Cultural Studies Theory and Practice, Tony Bennett and John Frau's edited book The Sage Handbook of Cultural Analysis, and Simon During's edited volume The Cultural Studies Reader. Again, let me remind you, as I have done in many cases, that these are of course by no means the only books that you may read in this area or the only books that I may consult, but most of the quotations and the main formulations are drawn from these books. As you are aware, these are really 1 hour lectures, and within the time frame of 1 hour, I am trying to get to you as many formulations and many different aspects and facets of each and every topic, right. So, let us move on, and really one of the most important persons in who has been sort of rallying for cultural studies policy making, cultural studies, rallying for the effectiveness of cultural studies, rallying for changes that cultural studies may eventually bring, has been Tony Bennett. And among others, Tony Bennett, for instance, in putting policy into culture, in his essay Putting Policy into Cultural Studies, says that cultural studies, as it has been largely practiced over at least the last 2 decades, stands guilty really of being at times purely semiological, and that is why he says that there has to be a critique. If you look at this slide, a critique of the purely semiological or issues only of meaning making and of representation of codes, of encoding and decoding codes, which has been a very important area or aspect of cultural studies. Indeed, it is contemporary cultural studies differentiates itself and tries to say that we have the niche that has been created by cultural studies is a niche which has been created by structuralism and post-structuralist theories and their impact on various fields. So, A is the critique of the purely semiological, and B is again a reiteration or an insistence on materiality or on our material lives. So, this is a critique that is not been given only by Tony Bennett, but several others, and my next lecture, lecture 39 of this series, is entitled Critiquing Cultural Studies, where I shall be taking up more of these. So, suffice it for us now to say that Tony Bennett and others have pointed out to the fact that there has to be a certain effectiveness of cultural studies, and if cultural studies has to be effective, cultural studies has to see itself as a part of governance. This is one of the points Tony Bennett makes, that we cannot leave out, we have to see ourselves as an arm of the government, not simply as an academic exercise, not an exercise where we just write essays and books. So, let us see how we can how this unfolds. So, this the issue of cultural policy really is, we call it the cultural policy debate, right. This culture policy debate is whether we should study culture and cultural practices and their signifying practices, or how much and how much should policy be a part of it, right. And this is also known as the criticism policy polarity, that is, there are 2 poles. Criticism is one pole, criticism discursive. Remember, we had said very early on in the in the first or second lecture that criticism or cultural studies is a way of talking about something, a way of criticism, a way of critiquing our cultural practices and our cultural forms. Okay. So, criticism policy, whether to go in for criticism or whether to go in for policy, this has also been a polarity. Okay. Or so essentially this is the debate, okay, the culture policy or the criticism policy debate. So, one of the first persons then who we have to talk about when we talk about the role of the intellectual, okay, when we discuss what intellectuals, not only in cultural studies, but in general, it may also be from the sciences, could be also from from technology. So, the question that was raised early on by none other than Antonio Gramsci, and really Gramsci's formulation is by now known by known by everyone in cultural studies, and I urge you to you also to consider this very carefully, right. Gramsci made a distinction between two types of intellectuals, right. He said that on the one hand there is the traditional intellectual, and on the other hand there is the organic intellectuals. By simply looking at the two terms, I am sure by now we have some idea of what he is driving at, what Gramsci wanted to tell us. Okay. He himself being an activist, he himself was imprisoned, and his famous work is something that all of you should read. Selections from his his prison notebooks is a book that is available widely also in Indian in its Indian edition. Anyhow, so traditional intellectual and the organic intellectual, these are the two types of intellectuals that he distinguished, okay, in not just academics, but also in among the general public. And who is a traditional intellectual and who is an organic intellectual is what we are going to see. We are going to now look at this definition in the way Barker has formulated it, okay, in his book Cultural Studies, Theory and Practice. Okay, now I am reading from Barker, and we shall open this up. Traditional intellectuals are those persons who fill, look at this term, okay, who fill the scientific, literary, philosophical and religious positions in society. Okay. So, for instance, there are already available platforms, there are already available jobs, available professions, and the traditional intellectual, okay, is an intellectual who holds such a position, okay, that is sanctioned by the government, for instance, sanctioned by authority, and they fill up. Now, the word fill here is very important, very telling, I should say, okay, who fill the scientific, literary and philosophical and religious positions in society. This would include those working in universities, schools, churches, the media, medical institutions, publishers and law firms, etc. Okay. So, people who essentially therefore hold jobs, okay, and who hold jobs that are sanctioned, as I said, by power and authority. For Gramsci, what do these are traditional intellectuals, right. So, what is their function in society, right, and then we shall see later on how they are different from the organic intellectual. Now, let us look at this slide here. For Gramsci, as Barker says, they produce, maintain and circulate those ideologies constitutive of hegemony that become naturalized as common sense. Now, by this lecture you will be able to, I am sure, relate this very well, hegemony and ideologies. Ideology is a term to which we had dedicated 2 lectures, okay, in module 2, I think. And hegemony also we saw as an important Gramscian term, okay, which talked about the power and the influence and impact of institutions to which we give our consent. So, for Gramsci, these intellectuals, these traditional intellectuals are they hold these traditional positions in society, traditional professions in society, and they are distinguished by the organic from the organic intellectual in the sense that they are usually in tune, okay, in tune with the prevailing ideology and the prevailing hegemony. Now, if you go by Marxism and you remember what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had argued, that the the ruling ideology or the ruling ideas of any age, okay, are the ideas of the ruling class, right, of those in power. So, these intellectuals are going to sort of go by, okay, they are going to go by, and as these are the words used, they are going to produce, they are going to maintain, and they are going to, say for instance a teacher would then maintain, okay, would and circulate through his or her teaching, would circulate those ideas which are held by the ruling class, those ideas that are held by the ones in power. Very rarely, according to the schema, okay, this binary opposition, very rarely will the would the traditional intellectual go against, right, the government, for instance, or go against an institutional authority, right. So, these are people who maintain, so to speak, the status quo, as we use the word, who maintain the status quo, and who sort of proliferate, help in proliferating the ideologies of the ruling class, and thereby who sort of maintain, okay, social order. Now, again through Barker, let us see what Gramsci meant by the organic intellectual. By contrast, Barker says, the organic intellectuals are said to be a constitutive part, okay, of working class and later feminist, post-colonial, African American, etc. struggle. They are said to be the thinking and organizing elements of the counter-hegemonic class and its allies. Now, by this definition, okay, Gramsci refers to the organic intellectual as one who sees his or her duty, so to speak, okay, as one that has to stand up for marginalized communities, okay, for underprivileged communities or classes, even caste, gender, okay, and who through their work, okay, are going to sort of contest, right, prevailing ideologies, okay. They will contest prevailing ideologies, they are going to critique the way, okay, a so called social order is maintained by the ruling class, okay, by power and authority, by giving us an ideology which is really in their service, okay. So, the organic intellectuals, okay, the word organic, okay, the organic that is almost tied to the soil, okay, tied to roots, committed, okay, to people of the so called lower classes, okay, and the so called lower castes. So, these all the organic intellectuals are a part of these working class communities or part of feminist movement, etc. Now, this is of course not to say this that a person in a profession, say a university professor for instance, or even a doctor or even an engineer, it is not to say that while they are holding, right, to say that while they are holding a position that they cannot be organic intellectuals, right. This is not to say that people who fall under the traditional intellectual schema, that they cannot be organic intellectuals. It is not that organic intellectuals are only activists and that traditional intellectuals are also the university professor is always a traditional intellectual. Okay. Even as one holds, okay, even as one holds a university position, or one is a doctor or is an engineer or a lawyer, within the setup of the traditional professions, there are many, okay, who have served as organic intellectuals, right. So, to be an organic intellectual, it is not necessary really, I feel, that you have to go out, okay, to stage a protest. Okay. Your very work, your very teaching, right, could be fulfilling all the requirements of the organic intellectual. So, you may belong to a particular class, will belong to, Marx belonged to the bourgeoisie, okay, but he was an organic intellectual. So, these organic intellectuals fight against or write against the counter hegemonic the hegemonic class of society, therefore form a very important and powerful counter-hegemonic critique of the working of ideology. So, a similar distinction is made, like Gramsci's, by Jim McGuigan in his book Culture and the Public Sphere. Okay. He like Gramsci, he differentiates between critical intellectuals and practical intellectuals. Now, you see, it is parallel to Gramsci's traditional intellectual and organic intellectuals, and I am bringing him here, McGuigan here also, just to show that it was not only Gramsci, though he very importantly he began this distinction between traditional intellectual and the organic intellectual, but other critics have also made these very important distinctions between types of individuals. So, according to Jim McGuigan, critical intellectuals are academic workers and practical intellectuals are cultural workers. Now, in this sense, again, as I say that a practical intellectual is not necessary that these are absolutely absolutely quarantined from one another, so to speak. Okay? So, a practical intellectual could also be an academic worker, and a critical intellectual could also be a cultural worker. However, today's discussion being on cultural policy, we are going to look at practical intellectuals and what they have to give to society in the form of being cultural workers. Right. A similar point is also made by Michel Foucault, in where he talks about the specific intellectual, okay? The specific intellectual and government or governmentality. Right. Now, you recall that the first lecture in this module, module number 4, which was on cultural industries and cultural forms, we had occasion to talk quite at length about Theodor Adorno and his work on culture industry, and I shall quickly quote from Adorno and see what he had to say about cultural work. So, he says here, whoever speaks of culture speaks of administration as well, whether this is his intention or not. Very beautifully put. You cannot talk only of culture and say that it has nothing to do with administration, right. So, whoever speaks of culture speaks of administration as well, whether this is his intention or not. Culture betrays from the outset the administrative view. So, tied into the meaning of culture. Now, here we get another aspect of culture, which we have not really talked about much elsewhere, though it was surely there, as whenever we talked about culture as bringing in change, culture studies as having one of its chief aims as bringing about important changes regarding equality in society. Okay. Culture therefore betrays from the outset or has built into it the administrative aspect, the task of which is looking down from on high is to assemble, distribute, evaluate and organize. This is what we can say falls in the domain of cultural policy. Okay. Assembling cultural products, distributing cultural products, evaluating their impact on society, evaluating their representation, also their representational impact, and organizing the way these cultural forms and cultural institutions, all these will be made available to the people. Okay. So, therefore, what is cultural policy? To put it in more formal terms, what is cultural policy and how may we define cultural policy? Okay. Cultural policy therefore may be defined as the regulation, management and administration of cultural forms, cultural artifacts, products, institutions, industries, any product that we have made as a part of our, or as a result of our cultural life, or we may say again as a result of our way of life. This is very important. Okay? Therefore, cultural policy, right, because somebody will obviously administer, right, somebody will be in charge of administrating and administrating the way all these cultural products will be regulated, managed and administered. For instance, let me give you the example of censorship. Okay? Censorship, particularly say of books or films. What is censorship? Censorship is part and parcel of cultural policy. Why? Because it is regulating, the first term here, okay? It is regulating a cultural product. A film cannot be passed by the censor board, okay? So, what is the censor board essentially doing as it clips some of its, parts, or it, stops the film from being shown altogether to the public? There is a regulation going on. That is, there are certain policies that have been made. Okay. So, also the management and administration of the institutions that are to do with, and we shall see what these institutions are, right. So, institutions, therefore, cultural policy institutions are institutions that produce and govern the form and content. Okay. Both produce and govern, that is regulate the form and content of cultural products. And what do we mean by cultural products? Again, cultural products may range from books, from media, media products, to the internet, okay, to the way we live our lives, right, and to the educational system, everything, the legal system, the judicial system. Okay. So, these are institutions that produce and govern the form and content of cultural products. Therefore, if we want a list, and if you ask, if we ask what are, the different different institutions that we have referred to here of cultural policy, of cultural management, regulation and administration. These may be, for instance, please look at this slide, art and culture councils, these are museums, these are government departments that have to do with culture and the proliferation and management of culture and cultural products. These are also educational institutions. Okay. As we know, culture is not simply culture does not mean dance, culture does not mean song, culture does not mean the theatre as we usually understand these as cultural. Okay. What you are taught in your schools and colleges and your universities are also cultural in nature. So, educational institutions are also part and parcel of the administration, that is of cultural policy. Then media, obviously media industries and corporations are part and parcel of cultural policy, so also advertising agencies. Also media, obviously media industries, media corporations are also part and parcel, they are also the wings of or the agencies of cultural policy. And importantly, advertising agencies. Why? Because as we saw, too many of us advertising products kind of decide, they create our desires, okay, they decide on important decisions regarding regarding use, regarding purchase of objects, also deciding our lifestyles, right. So, all these art and culture councils, museums, government departments, educational institutions, media industries and corporations and advertising agencies, among other things, are what we call the agents of cultural policy. Okay. So, these agents, these are councils, government bodies, etc., media corporations, what they do is they they are responsible eventually in the formation of cultural values in people. By cultural values, again, is not meant simply what kind of music is held to be of high value, etc. By cultural values are also values by which we lead our life. These are essentially values created that create identities, that create subjectivities. They are values that are sort of garnered by us through ideology. Okay. So, what kind of ideology or worldview is produced and disseminated by these cultural bodies, okay, in the name of cultural policy is extremely important, because it has great implications for our lives and the decisions that we take. Second, these institutions have tremendous social power or cultural power. Why do they have social cultural power? They have social cultural power because they decide on what cultural artifacts we are allowed to peruse, what cultural artifacts we are allowed to create. In that, of course, you will agree that there is there is a great deal of power that is given to these bodies. And finally, they are responsible for the production and circulation of meanings. So, therefore, what cultural studies practitioners should do, right, in order, for instance, to become an organic intellectual from a traditional intellectual, what is for instance, a university professor, okay, expected to do? We can be more proactive, or we can make more contribution, right, to cultural policy by also helping these agencies of cultural policy to adopt and also to remind ourselves to adopt a more pragmatic approach. Okay? I think you recall that in one of the lectures, perhaps the one on language, we had occasion to talk about Richard Rorty and pragmatism, right. So, instead of dwelling all the time on meaning production, on the semiotics of various media forms, etc., perhaps one of the things that cultural academic workers, so to speak, or critical intellectuals, as given to us by McGuigan, could do is to adopt a more pragmatic approach and to work with cultural producers, right. In working or by working with cultural producers, what we do is we help or aid in policy creation. The expertise that one gains from having done research or having taught cultural studies, right, the understanding of the politics of the signifier, the understanding of ideologies, the understanding of the history, okay, of ideas, okay, what the academic intellectual could therefore do is to steer is to steer policy creation or to enable policy creation and to steer policies in what could be the right direction. Okay. This is of course not to say that cultural workers or the organic intellectuals do not have a similar contribution to make. The point is that instead of remaining on one side of the culture policy debate or polarity, as many of the scholars here in this list of books that I have used, or these books that were used for this lecture, most of them, if not all of them, have said that there has to be a coalition of cultural workers and the academic intellectuals. Therefore, Barker, again let us go back to Barker's cultural studies. Barker in his book Cultural Studies therefore says that since why is cultural policy important? Okay? It is important because again those who have the power to produce and control the distribution and eventually the consumption of cultural products have immense power. Okay? So, the power is in creating official versions of something. Okay. If you create an official version, that version is a version that one uses, many of us use, that is a version that comes down to us as the so called legitimate version, right. So, cultural studies and cultural policy have the policy makers can make official versions, they have the power to name, okay, whatever is given to us as official versions become part of common sense and is accepted by many people as common sense as eventually the natural versions of things. Okay? Whereas, on the other hand we see that this is just one of the versions that has been sort of officialized, right, and all these eventually legitimize some forms and some institutions of culture as being worthier, so to speak, as being official and as being very powerful. And that is why Barker says that these institutions have power, these agencies have power, and cultural policy therefore they have it's extremely important because that is really the thing that links cultural products to the people in general, right. Therefore, meaning, as we saw, meaning and truth, we've seen this throughout our our lectures. Meaning and truth have A, power, and B, are given to us by institutions of power. Therefore, cultural politics, as I said, to sum up, has the power to name things, has the power to define things, or as we saw in the lecture on discourse, has tremendous discursive power. Okay? And even though there may be different ways of descriptions, okay, there are different ways of definitions of things, only those definitions stick, or only those labels and names stick which usually have an official sanction, okay, sanctioned by agencies of cultural policy. Therefore, Barker also says that cultural policy, now this is through Barker we understand cultural policy as A, an arm of government, okay, B, it is a part of social regulation, C, it is used to identify the different aspects of culture and their managerial operations. We have seen all this, governmentality, regulation and management. Then also in cultural policy, we should assess the forms of politics inherent in all kinds or domains of cultural practice. We should recognize the centrality of policy and the modes of strategic intervention in culture and cultural forms, particularly the production, distribution and consumption, which is really saying all about these forms and institutions, right. Therefore, one of the chief things that many scholars have agreed on over these years, as when the since the beginning, or the formalization, so to speak, of talking about cultural policy was made. These scholars say that one of the ways of defining cultural policy is through pragmatism. Now, pragmatism, as we have seen in the lecture on language, it is defined by three things, that it sees it sees phenomena as essentially unrepresentable. You cannot represent phenomena in all their entirety. Why? Because your own cognitive apparatus and your own notions and your own training only allow certain aspects to be seen. This is something we have talked about a couple of times in the lectures on representation. In the first module also we have talked about it. Okay. So, it is anti-representational in the sense that it says that you have to accept the fact that we cannot represent anything in its any phenomenon, whether scientific or cultural, in its entirety, and hence we can only talk about representation effects, right. Every representation is an effect, every articulation is a representation, and every representation therefore is not representation proper, it is a representation effect. Second, it is anti-foundationalist. Anti-foundationalism holds that there are no really true foundations to knowledge, there are no eternal givens of knowledge. Knowledge is always provisional. Knowledge, the foundations of knowledge also change, as we saw in our lecture on science, technology and cultural studies. You remember when we talked about the cultural studies interrogation of science and technology, we also there we found that science itself, which purports us to give the truth, or which many believe gives us the truth, science itself moves from, in the case of Kuhn's articulation, for instance, science itself moves from paradigm shift to paradigm shift. So, there cannot be a foundation, or at the most there can be different foundations, variants of foundations in different times. And finally, it is anti-realist in the sense that it pragmatism does not say or claim to any full knowledge of what is reality. Okay. So, essentially, of course, this is an area in philosophy, but it has come into cultural studies. Why? Because it ties in largely with many of the central tenets of cultural studies, of representation being problematic, of foundations being always provisional, okay, and of course, discursive and an anti-realist orientation. Okay. And again, all these aspects are to be used or are to be appropriated for social reform, this being the most important aspect of cultural policy. So, before we wind up this lecture, you may think why there have been policies, there have been, for instance, not that museums and art councils etc. were not there, and that they did not do any sort of cultural administration. the issue of cultural policy really came in with this issue or a kindred issue, that is the politics of difference, right. If race, gender, sexuality and class, okay, are built into cultural forms, right, then the politics of difference has to be the informing, so to speak, or the motivation, right, the motivation behind cultural policy. A way of describing cultural policy could also be in the sense of policing, right, policy as policing. So, if we are to be sensitive to issues of race, gender, sexuality and class, then policy has to see, there have to be policies that are going to see that certain races, certain genders, sexualities and classes are not misrepresented, okay. So that the hegemonic dominant order order does not misrepresent or continue to make some races, classes, genders, etc. Marginalized all the time, right. So, this is one way in which the politics of difference has contributed to at least what we may call contemporary cultural policy studies. Then we would I would like to refer to Andrew Milner, okay, in his book Contemporary Cultural Theory. He says that a democratic common culture cannot be made from within the intellectual class itself, and this is again talking about the importance of policy and the practical worker, cultural worker. A democratic common culture cannot be made from within the intellectual class itself or that class alone, but only from within those exploited and oppressed classes and groups, the cultural lives of which have proved by turn the objects of realist neglect, modernist disdain and postmodernist pastiche. A very loaded statement here. Okay. He says that to be truly democratic in the sense of representation, at least to be fully representational of all classes and all gender, all sexualities, all races, classes, etc. Okay. We cannot rely only on the intellectual class. The members of or what he calls those within the exploited and oppressed class, according to Milner, bring in a certain experience, okay, bring in a certain immediacy, and if one can hazard this word, a certain authenticity, because of a background of or a history of exploitation and oppression. And these classes, he says very importantly in these last words, which are very powerful, that the cultural lives, the way of life, the cultural products and institutions of these classes, okay, have been the objects of neglect by the the culture of the realist movement. They have been the disdain of modernism, particularly modernism of the high modernism kind, and postmodernist pastiche. For instance, in the sense that bits and pieces from these marginalized cultures are brought in a token sort of a way, okay, into issues of representation, but postmodernist pastiche or postmodernist sort of collaging, okay, collaging of bits and pieces from marginalized groups will never really liberate the marginalized classes. And that is why, as Milner says here in this quotation, okay, we cannot rely only on the intellectual class. So, Milner somehow thinks that the authenticity comes only from one who has been through the structures and realities of domination and oppression. I would like to end this with an important point further that Milner makes, that is, we should not say again, to put a caveat to what Milner says really, we cannot say simply that those who have been through, oppression, those who have been through domination in their lives, that they are the ones who are always going to have a balanced view, so to speak. There is also a danger of a counter assertion, a counter representation, okay, which shows only their way of life to be authentic, to be where there is no problematization of a counter, a representation from the other side, so to speak. Okay. So, we have to be careful of the word authenticity here. That is why we have put this in single inverted commas, and we have to see, as it is mentioned here in this quotation, that move is precluded by the logic of post structuralism. However, if whiteness and blackness are each constituted within and through discourse, then there can be, very importantly, there can be no extra discursively real black or real post colonial identity to which a multicultural or post colonial cultural politics might appeal for validation. Okay. So, this is extremely important from a post structuralist point of view. Again, this is now we are again problematizing even cultural policy. Okay. If cultural policy, as has been said, argued by many critics, has to rely more and more on the practical worker and the one with the experience of oppression and domination. So, if we believe all the time that the narrative that is coming to us from counter assertion, that is a true narrative, then in that sense we forget that even the narrative of authentic black, authentic white, or authentic feminism, or authentic sexualities, counter sexualities, these are also ascribed, or these are also available to us in language. Now, the richness of cultural studies therefore is this, that even as we understand the fact that things are given to us in language, the language is the mediating factor, even then we can also formulate cultural policies, okay, which even as it sees, or even as it accepts the fact that cultural realities are always given to us in discourse, through discourse, there is a very important understanding of the fact that after all, a pragmatic line has to be taken by both academicians and cultural workers. There is no last word to this really. This debate is a very strong one, and this debate is going to continue. There will always be workers from the cultural front, and there will always be the traditional intellectuals and the critical intellectuals. Okay? But the fact is, what I am saying is the growing importance of cultural policy in cultural studies is one very healthy side. So, let us go to the discussion. So, the first question, what are the two types of intellectuals according to Gramsci? According to Gramsci, there are two kinds of intellectuals, and these are the traditional intellectuals and the organic intellectuals. And if you have to explain this, and you say that the traditional intellectuals are those intellectuals who hold the traditional positions in society, and just holding a traditional position in society does not mean that one cannot be an organic intellectual. So, the traditional intellectual according to Gramsci is one who who believes in and one who helps in the proliferation of the dominant ideologies of the time, of the ideas of the dominant classes. Okay? Whereas, the organic intellectual is one who is who usually comes from the working class, or is engaged in the feminist movement, okay, who is as the word organic suggests here, who is tied to roots, who is tied to the soil, who is whose works. Now, even if one is a traditional intellectual, it does not mean, as we saw, that one cannot be an organic intellectual. The work done from the platform of traditional intellectual, at least from the platforms of traditional institutions like the universities, for instance, one can also make important contributions as an organic intellectual. Second, we also saw through McGuigan that corresponding to Antonio Gramsci's formulation, we have critical intellectuals who are the academic workers, which corresponds to the traditional intellectual of Gramsci, practical intellectuals who are the cultural workers who correspond to the organic intellectuals as given to us by Gramsci. What is cultural policy concerned with? This is our second question. Cultural policy is concerned with the regulation, management and administration of cultural forms, institutions and products, and these are institutions that produce and govern the form and content of cultural products. Then what are the instruments of cultural policy, or what are the agencies of cultural policy? These agencies or instruments are, among others, they may take different names, right, different labels in different countries, but usually they are, we understand these as councils of arts and culture. These are museums. For instance, what is going to be represented in a museum? You can, you can unpack some of these words. If there is a long, question carrying more marks, you can say, for instance, what is going to be shown or showcased in museums as being primitive, right? What is going to be showcased in museums as having cultural value, okay? What is shown in the name of ethnicity, etc. These are hugely, important questions from the point of view of power and politics. Okay, when you go to a museum, we simply consume art, the artifacts being shown there as per the labels perhaps that are given, or the brochure that you have in your hands. Okay, cultural politics, cultural policy would have to be reformulated by these investigations into the very representation, okay, in these brochures and in these labels of museum artifacts, for instance. Then departments of culture, right, in governments, okay, which after all they are the ones, these are the departments that regulate, the department. And I will give you an example of, for instance, the censorship board in our country, for instance, okay, and in all countries. So these government departments are the ones really that are going to eventually decide what comes to you as a cultural product and what doesn't, and in what form and content also that these come to you. Then as I said, educational institutions are also part of the agencies that are responsible for cultural policy, in the sense that the educational boards and institutions, they decide what is going to be circulated to students. Then media industries and corporations, and this we do not have to even explain, we have talked about this so much in media and culture industries and commodities, new media, etc. Advertising agencies are also part and parcel of cultural policy making. So, this really brings us to a close, or as far as the distribution of topics in these lectures on cultural studies as a distribution is concerned. Okay. Cultural policy really is the last topic in the sense of being a topic proper. The next two lectures are really by way of closure, in the sense that in the next lecture we are going to talk about the critique of cultural studies, how some limitations of cultural studies as a discipline, right? How cultural studies can be better by sort of paying heed to sometimes quite vituperative criticisms that are levied against this domain. We shall see why many react so sharply to cultural studies as a discipline, so that we can learn from these and make our discipline more strong. And after that, in the last lecture, in lecture 40, we are going to do summing up of what we have seen, or what we have talked about, what we have deliberated upon in all the lectures, from the first lecture to lecture 39, and we are going to see what we have learned. Okay. So, let us stop here for today, and we shall meet for the next lecture, which is on critiquing cultural studies. Thank you.